Welcome to Wilson's Point. We do hope you enjoy your visit to this historic, yet peaceful and relaxing site. To help you better understand the significance of the point, we would like to explain the history of this area with emphasis on the Scottish influence. We would also like to explain what is here at the point for you to see and experience. Wilson's Point is situated at the confluence of the southwest and northwest Miramichi rivers. It is a small acreage, seemingly pointing itself into the downstream flow of these two rivers. Beaubears Island is to the south of the point, across what is locally known as the Tickle. Further across the river, in the same direction, is the former village of Nelson, now part of the city of Miramichi. Apart from the natives, the first known occupants of this portion of land were the Acadians at the time of their expulsion. They set up camp here temporarily while they awaited transportation to Quebec. Unfortunately, their experience was anything but pleasant, and many did not survive the harsh winters and the lack of food. Some of these Acadians are buried here in the unmarked graves. The Acadian camps were all deserted by 1760. The cairn in this picture was erected in 2006 to commemorate the Acadians' occupation of this site. The first English-speaking settlers to arrive in this area were William Davison and John Court. William Davison was born in Banffshire, Scotland, and was 25 years of age when he arrived on the Miramichi. John Court was from Aberdeenshire, Scotland. He made his home at Wilson's Point while William Davison lived at Elmtree, now Upper Derby. In 1765, Davison and Court received a grant of 100,000 acres of land in the Miramichi area. Beginning at the eastern end of Beaubears Island, this land extended up the shores of the northwest and southwest Miramichi rivers, a distance of 13 miles, as far as Red Bank and Quarryville. The area of Wilson's Point, also part of this grant, became the focal point of their industrial endeavors over the next 25 years. William Davison's main interest in coming to Canada, and particularly to the Miramichi area, was to establish a salmon fishery, catching, curing, and exporting fish. His family in Scotland had been involved in the fishing industry for a number of years, so he was somewhat knowledgeable of what it involved. As the salmon fishery progressed, there was need for William Davison to have a means of exporting his fish to Europe and the West Indies, so he developed the shipbuilding industry. His 300-ton schooner called the Miramichi, built in 1773, was the first sailing vessel built here for which there is any record. It was presumably built at his shipyard on the north side of the southwest Miramichi, a few miles above Wilson's Point at Elmtree. It was the largest vessel built in New Brunswick before 1789 and the largest built in Miramichi for more than 50 years hence. During the American Revolution, William Davison experienced problems with American rebels partnering with natives and inciting them to destroy anything that belonged to the English settlers. Davison moved to Majorville on the St. John River in 1777, where he established New Brunswick's first masting industry, and as he said, earned a livelihood for himself and his family until times should change. And change they did. When the war ended in 1783, he returned to Miramichi, only to find that everything he had established here lay in ruins. But he began anew and soon had his fishing and shipbuilding industries operating again, to which he added a lumbering industry with the establishment of several sawmills along the river. The first of these sawmills was located at the Mill Stream, a sawmill industry that continued to operate there for more than 100 years. Although it seems that Davison and Court were primarily interested in industry in the Miramichi area, they also made progress with settlement along the river. The settlers were scattered along both branches of the river rather than being clustered in just one area. In fact, by 1820, the surnames of those living along the Miramichi would indicate a predominantly Scottish settlement. In her book, Ships of the Miramichi, Louise Manny writes, "By 1790 he, William Davison, had made great progress. He had well-established fisheries with markets in Europe and the West Indies. He had an active shipyard, and 3 large double sawmills. He had contracts for all the masts and lumber he could produce. He had established a home for his wife and 5 children. He was a leader in every phase of the life of the community and prominent in the business and political life of the province, and he had big plans for the further expansion of his industries. But in 1790, William Davison met an untimely death due to exposure. He is buried in the cemetery here at Wilson's Point. His original tombstone is still here, but it is difficult to read the inscription, so a new stone has been placed beside the old one. By the year 1790, there were significant numbers of settlers within the Miramichi area to warrant the establishment of a church. The church was to be built at Wilson's Point. In those days, it was assumed that the point would be the center of the new town site, and since the cemetery already existed at the point, it was an appropriate site for the new church. James Anderson was the designer and builder of St. James Church of Scotland, a Presbyterian church at Wilson's Point. Anderson was brought from Scotland by William Davison in 1784 and died in 1797. Anderson is buried here in this cemetery. The first clergymen to preach here were itinerant ministers who traveled extensively over the Atlantic region. We know of at least 2 ministers who were here in the 1790s, James Fraser and James MacGregor. They preached and baptized at various points along the river, including Wilson's Point. The first resident Protestant minister in the Miramichi area was Reverend John Urquhart. He preached at St. James Church from 1802 until his death in 1814. Reverend Urquhart was a native of Cromarty, Scotland, and he and his wife, Mary, had 11 children, most of whom married and raised families in the Miramichi area. The church at Wilson's Point continued to be used for services until 1832. By 1827, the new St. James Presbyterian Church in Newcastle, now St. James and St. John United Church, was completed. As more and more people attended this new church, the church here at the Point was no longer useful. The building was sold by auction on May 1, 1838. The foundation markings of the old church are still visible. An archaeological dig was undertaken in 2003 to verify the location of the original building. The new structure was not placed in the same location because of the protected nature of the property. The old cemetery here at Wilson's Point lies between the site of the original church building and the tip of the point. Many of the earliest settlers from along the river are buried here, but when restoration was first undertaken in 1946, only 17 identifiable tombstones remained. All 17 old tombstones still exist, but most of the inscriptions are very difficult, if not impossible, to read. However, new marble markers were placed at the grave sites in 2003. The beautiful wrought iron gates at the entrance to the cemetery date back to the mid-1800s. They were created by John Norman, a Scotsman who came to Miramichi about 1840, as an entrance to the home of Alexander Rankin in Douglastown. When the Rankin House became a school, the gates were removed and eventually purchased by Lord Beaverbrook to be used here. Enclosures, such as shown here, commonly enclose the graves at the point. It is still possible to see where some of these fenced areas existed. Lord Beaverbrook was referring to these fenced grave sites when he called the park the enclosure. John Wilson was a New Jersey loyalist who settled at Wilson's Point in 1784. He was appointed the first Justice of the Peace for Northumberland County. He also operated a tavern at the point in view of the river, just beyond the right-hand corner of what is today's parking lot. The first meeting of the Court of Quarter Session for Northumberland County, what would later become Northumberland County Council, was held at John Wilson's Tavern on September 15, 1789. This is further indication that the point was considered to be the center of business and government for the Miramichi area and was in William Davison's plan for a town site. It should be noted that before 1820, Wilson's Point was known as Point de Boishebert, Beaubert's Point, and Miramichi Point. Then in 1820, it was named for Scotsman and ferryman John Wilson, not the same person as the tavern owner. John Wilson came from Orkney, Scotland, arriving in Miramichi about 1819 and settled in Wilson's Point. Although he worked at various occupations, he is best known as the ferryman from the point. Doreen Menzies Arbuckle, in her book, The Northwest Miramichi, says there was an early ferry service that operated at the Tickle, beginning in 1813 with Charles Vye as the ferryman. In the 1840s, John Wilson was operating a ferry from Wilson's Point to the north and south side of the Miramichi River, as well as to Beaubert's Island. The ferry that he operated was most likely horse-powered, the common type of ferry in the early 19th century. The ferry service continued until 1856, when the Northwest Bridge was built. Shipbuilding operations on Beaubert's Island had all but ceased, and all commercial activity had moved to the towns of Newcastle and Chatham. By the mid-1900s, the decrepit state of the cemetery grounds at Wilson's Point was brought to the attention of Lord Beaverbrook. Lord Beaverbrook's father, William Maxwell Aiken, had preached at St. James Presbyterian Church in Newcastle when Lord Beaverbrook was a boy. In 1945, Lord Beaverbrook purchased the land at the point, which had been designated a burying ground, to be used solely as a memorial to the old pioneers of the Miramichi who are buried there. He also purchased land owned by Margaret Wilson and Donald Fraser. Then, all the fallen trees and debris were cleared, paths were created throughout the site, and tombstones were repaired. When finished, Lord Beaverbrook gave the property to the province of New Brunswick to be kept forever as a historic site, in memory of the early pioneers of the Miramichi. It was at that time that he chose the name The Enclosure for the area. In 2001, the New Brunswick Highland Society at Miramichi decided that the pioneer Scottish cemetery at Wilson's Point was once again in need of restoration. Their vision was that the area inside the cemetery gates reflect and promote the early Scottish presence for the benefit of future generations. The Scottish Heritage Association was then formed, their mandate being to make this vision a reality. The committee currently consists of 12 members who, since 2001, meet on a monthly basis. The following steps in the restoration process were completed. The cemetery and surrounding area was cleared of underbrush and walking trails were restored. The grounds were cleaned and groomed where possible. A new sign was purchased and placed at the entrance of the cemetery area. A monument to William Davison was purchased and installed on the grounds of the Interpretive Center. All the original grave markers were left intact, but new granite markers were also installed for each of the 17 identified graves. As much as possible, the original inscriptions, as recorded by Louise Manny in the 1940s, are engraved on these markers. An interpretation center was built in the form of a church, modeled after what was determined to be the style of the Presbyterian church that was located here for more than 40 years, 1790s to 1830s. Unfortunately, the building could not be placed at the site of the original church because of the historical significance of that property. Also, a floating dock has been built and is ready for installation at the site of the original wharf. An early 19th century pulpit was donated by the Anderson family of Burn Church. It was restored as closely as possible to its original condition and installed in this new building. The benches in the new building were obtained from the old Northumberland County Courthouse in Newcastle. In 2006, using stone from the old Miramichi Hospital, the foundation was faced, steps were built at the Interpretive Center, and down to the wharf location. In 2007, wrought iron rails have been installed on the front steps and wheelchair ramp, and a suitable railing was installed on the stairway to the wharf, and the work continues. There is still much to be done, particularly in the interior of the building, to make your visit here as informative as possible. This is a map of the trails in the old cemetery that you may now wish to travel. The outside path follows along the river around the point. Smaller paths through the graveyard area will take you to all the grave sites. Thank you for visiting with us today. We do hope you enjoy the remainder of your stay.